Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look into the Overdogs exotic gloves. This new piece of gear that we've gotten with Year 7 Season 2 is actually very interesting and powerful. It is a 30% amp tied to a certain conditionality. It is the same tier hierarchy as the Shroud, but where the Shroud starts at Tier 1 and works its way down. Here we're starting at Tier 3, and this Overdogs is working its way up. And it is very interesting, especially on the damage end. It is a lot, but we need to mostly actually discuss it in terms of uptime. That's also why we'll go into some gameplay with this video as well, the same as with the Shroud, and actually discuss what we think our uptime here will be. Overall, though, this is a gear piece well worth using, especially in certain builds, because, for instance, it also interacts with the Pestilence. We'll go over how to get this and also what it exactly is, how its talent works, and then we'll take it into some calculations and gameplay. First, we'll start off with just using it in a red build, but towards the end of the video, we'll also go into the Pestilence, and while I'm not certain that that will always stay that way as it is interacting at the time being with, for instance, skills and also the Pestilence, that might change in the future because I feel that isn't intended. Similar talents do not affect those things, but for the time being, yeah, it is what it is, and we'll use it as it is. So yeah, let's go get started, and let's start by discussing where we get the Overdogs from. We get it from the season track. It is, of course, in the season pass that we get it on level 29. Once you reach level 29, you can claim it. It is, as with all exotics on the season tracks, it is always a free item. You don't need to own the season pass for this. You can claim one from here, and that's also the only one you'll get. It's no longer the case that once you claim it from a season track, it'll be in the general loot pool and you can go farm for more. No. For the last few seasons and this season as well, once we claim one from here, that's the only one we'll get, usually up until the stretch goals. With the stretch goals, with the caches there, you can get some more, which is kind of annoying because, yeah, it is a very powerful item and I've been having to move it around between characters. And I wish they would go back to just, once you get one from the season track, it being in the general loot pool and you can farm for more. But for the time being, it is what it is. Now, of course, we should ask ourselves the important question of what is Overdogs? And we'll get the dad joke out of the way of saying, nothing much. What's Overdogs with you? With that horrendous joke out of the way, the Overdogs comes with the flavor text, start from the bottom and make your way up on these exotic gloves. It comes with weapon damage, crit chance, crit damage, the stats we would want for a crit build. And then we go to the talent, which is, of course, the same as the Shroud, but then with one difference. And let's discuss this talent, which is a little bit confusing if you just read through it. Once you start playing with it, though, it becomes clear pretty fast. This weakest link amplifies weapon damage by 30% to the lowest ranking enemies currently in combat as per tier hierarchy. And this is in juxtaposition to the Shroud, which is the highest ranking enemies currently in combat. And tier 1 is the highest tier, tier 3 is the lowest tier. Shroud works its way down, starting at the top. And yeah, as the flavor text kind of says, for the Overdogs, it is the underdog and starting at tier 3 and working its way up. Now, if we just read tier 3 by itself, which is any other enemy or skill proxy, well, any other enemy is dependent on the other two tiers and understanding what's in those. And skill proxies will be anything like the turrets that are being deployed, RC cars, drones that get put up, will be bonus against those, with the exception of mini tanks, which we would also quite often consider a proxy. That is within its own tier. But then, yeah, any other enemy is dependent kind of on these. If we just read through tier 1 and 2, we have hunters, rogues, leaders, tanks, shield, heavy weapons, RPG, medics, controller, warhounds, and marauders in tier 1. Also important to note that in this, there is no order of it. So it isn't like hunters need to be killed first before you can do medics, for instance. No, everything in tier 1 is one blob altogether. So we could do medics first and then the hunters. For instance, during extraction in Countdown, although they would all be in tier 1 together and we would need to deal with the enemies below them first for the Overdogs. In tier 2, we have support, engineer, bodyguard, immobilizer, bomber, mini tank, drone operator. And yeah, we need to effectively eliminate tier 3 first here, which is any other enemies, and then tier 2 basically is active against with this. And then once we've eliminated everything of the tier 2 category and nothing of those exists on the field, then tier 1 is there. There is no visual indicator for any of this, and that's kind of also, I'm guessing, the intended gameplay. They want you to somewhat memorize this or get a feel for this and work your way up. Now, having listed those, any other enemies, well, we are missing a bunch of archetypes here. Very importantly, what we're missing is assaults, a very common enemy type, grenadiers, also a very common enemy type. Then we're missing rushers, also a very common enemy type, and snipers. Not as common, but still a very annoying enemy type that we need to deal with. So, for instance, when we're fighting hyenas, let's say, we'll see some engineers and such, and we would then want to, if we want to min-max this, eliminate them later. There might be some medics in the field, there might be some shields. If any heavies spawn, we would want to do them somewhat later, and we can, of course, for instance, against hyenas, chain them, shoot the chain on their weapon, make them take a timeout for a few seconds, and then deal with the enemies, and then come back, for instance. Or the way we could also see this is because it is such a big amp, we just play as normal. And we take this kind of like crit chance. There is a chance that the enemy is going to be active against, that they're going to be bonused against. And overall, with how big of a bonus this 30% is, that actually just works out. Because a lot of enemies will be grenadiers, will be rushers, will be assaults, will be snipers. For instance, as well, Scorchers is missing in this list, which is the flamethrower ladies from Outcast, which are also very common. So a lot of enemy types are in this tier 3. In general gameplay, just doing activities and missions and such, I feel more than enough that you will have, even if you don't really pay attention to this list, if you just play normally, overall, you will still clear out faster because this 30% is so big. So I feel that by itself is a thing that we can do. And yeah, already people have very much discovered that that is a way to just use this. You just don't per se pay attention to this list. You just play normally, and overall it works out to be a bigger increase in damage than most other choices here. But alongside of that, it also is that if no enemy is left, or well, one enemy is left, no other enemies are left, doesn't matter what the tier hierarchy is, they're the only enemy. And in certain places, and for instance, the start of Countdown, where you're going up against hunters, even though they are in tier 1, nothing else has spawned in yet, unless somebody's skill gets hacked by them, and we get a tier 3 from that. Those hunters were bonused against, and that makes it, for instance, for that fight, a really good pick. And then we have to consider some of the harder fights in the game as well. If we consider the DUA Legendary, at the very end, we're just fighting that one heavy, the boss at the end. It doesn't matter that they're in tier 1, nothing else is alive, so we'll get bonused against them. But then if we take that thinking to, for instance, Roosevelt's final boss fight, where there are 2 Marauders, which are the thing that we generally want to kill first, they're in tier 1 and will be in combat against a bunch of other things, so we won't have a bonus there. So for some of those important fights, it is important to consider how the activeness of this works out. Are we bonused against the enemies? What is our uptime? And in certain places, it makes the most sense. And then in some places, yeah, you have to be a little bit more considerate. But for general play, just doing heroic and such, I feel this more than works out. Let's go start looking at some calculations for this. And let's start out by looking at this multi-calculator. Here we have a trio of multi-calculators. We'll especially go over these first 2 here and then take it into some gameplay. Well, and then we'll come back for a Pestilence comparison and then take that into some gameplay as well. These are multi-calculators of my design. There's a video on my channel if you want to go in depth with them and understand how these work, but especially the input for the gear happens down here. The input for the weapon is here. And then what we have is a mag damage, burst DPS, and a sustained DPS with some checking numbers as well to check in the range. And what we're getting out as well is percentages to compare these between. Here we're comparing against the top row with these numbers, and then also against the burst DPS of this one, which is the active Overdogs here on the right. And then what we have as our build is a strikers. We're taking strikers and an obliterate strikers in this case, and putting in an overdogs, putting in a coyote, putting in a bloody knuckles, putting in an exodus slash nimble slash rugged slash utility basically, where also that is the exact same as this would be when it is inactive. That is the same 100% there. And also looking at Centurion, both on its damage end and on its utility end, the magazine side end of it, the sustained DPS side of things for it. If we look at Overdogs, here set up at 60 crit chance inactive, and the way we reach 60 crit chance as well for a lot of these items, same for this, same for Tinkerer, same for Bloody and such. The optimal setup is actually to take 3 crit damage mods on the weapon and then take the crit chance on the gear. That way you can land exactly on 60. But that isn't an option for all weapons. Here we're using a Lexington as our comparison weapons, and all of these builds are running that. Then if we're using a FAMAS can only take 2 crit damage mods, and that would land on a 59. That's also why I've included the 57 version of it, kind of as illustrative purposes here, as I mangle up that word. But this 57 is then just taking crit chances on the gear, basically taking that coyote variant that we have, just sticking one more crit chance somewhere on the gear, and we land on 57. We see that the difference here on damage isn't that big. But for instance, if you're running killer or strained or fast hands, things that are affected by the crit chance, it does make a little bit of difference here on the DPS end, and then a little bit of difference there on the talents end. So it is overall better to set it up at that 60, and that's the number we'll be going for. But actually, in actual play, I've mostly just stuck to using it at 57 because I can keep my build the way it is set up for Coyote, and then just stick it on Overdogs, and then just swap a mod out from crit damage to crit chance and land on this 57 pretty quick instead of having to recalibrate 3 or 4 pieces of gear. All that to say, though, that we'll be using the 60 variant, but yeah, you can actually very quickly swap over to a 57 variant, especially if you have already Coyote variant saved up. And then as well, if you are in a team setting, if there are no other Coyotes, if everybody's running Overdogs or Tinkerers or things like that, it is actually very useful to have at least one Coyote in the team for its group-wide component. And then you can swap back really quickly as well, which I find is the right thing to do in those cases. Here we have first the Overdogs inactive. So if the talent is not active against the current enemy, that is our DPS. And that's the one we'll be comparing against, just so we can see how much we gain against, through some of these talents. And then basically as well, on this side, we have it against the active version, the percentages. Now, what we see once the Overdogs is active is, unsurprisingly, the DPS goes up by 30%. That's what a 30% amp should do. It just increases all of our damage by a separate multiplier of a 30. And yeah, we see that outcome here. Against that 57 version, yeah, we lose a little bit of damage if it was active, but then of course that would still be the same 30, but here, because we're using the 60 as our base there. If we look at Coyote in its optimal range as is set up for this build in 15 to 25, leaving a crit chance gap for it as well, we see that the Coyote is generally, as I say, yeah, it's a 6 to 9%, a 5 to 9% increase, and we see that kind of in here as well. The Coyote, against when the Overdogs is inactive, we have a close to 9% if we're in the right range. In either of the wrong ranges, either if we're too close or too far, it is just under 6%. But then, on the other end, when Overdogs is active, Overdogs is ahead against the right range by over 16%, and then on the wrong ranges, even over 18%. And that's kind of the deal here. If this number was a little bit smaller, I would find it harder to just outright recommend it, but we can kind of outright recommend it because it is such a big gap. It is basically 10% under and 20% over. And then here again, though, the real discussion will be uptime on this talent, because yeah, when we're looking at these numbers, yeah, this is the biggest number in here. That's going to be the case. It is going to be it will dwarf all of the other ones. But of course, we have a little bit more control, for instance, with Coyote over our range. Thinking about Bloody Knuckles, we have a lot of control over when we activate those by just meleeing an enemy. With Centurion, we can activate it by just being in the swapping weapons correctly at the correct times and such. With the Overdogs, you're much more dependent on the content alongside of all the other things. For instance, if we consider Bloody Knuckles here, one of the places Bloody gets used quite a lot, especially if it's on a chest striker, because here's what we're an Obliterate striker, it is actually additive. That's 25 total weapon damage that the Bloody Knuckle has, even though I also actually, it says 25 weapon damage. That isn't the case for it. It is 25 total weapon damage. Here, adding to the Obliterate, it becomes a little bit over 20%, close to a 21% increase. If it's on a chest striker, which doesn't have any total weapon damage, then it is a full 25%. But let's consider the Lovebirds fight, for instance, where the Bloody is a common tool to be used always. There, meleeing the enemies and getting that bonus for just long enough to murder them. Yeah, we can get that done. Here, the Overdogs would not actually work because it spawns a bunch of assaults on the outsides if you're doing the quick strats for it. With that, there is enemies there that will make you inactive. Basically, you'll the bonus will be active against then tier 1 enemy or tier 1 enemies, which are those assaults on the outside, and you won't have it against the 2 big bosses in front. Where with the Bloody, we could. And even though then the Bloody would still be at 25%, it will be a 25% that we can use. So that is going to be the discussion here mostly. And as it was with the Shroud as well, is just how much uptime can we have on it. But it is important to know these numbers and basically know that, yeah, when we're inactive, we're this much ahead or this much behind, and when we're active, we're this much ahead. Because that can help us really talk about, with a little bit of uptime, yeah, how much can we gain out of it. Here we see as well with Centurion, where we do have some control over it, where if we weapon swap correctly, especially on the rate of fire and weapon damage end, we gain quite a bit there. And one thing to note as well, even with the Centurion, actually, with even the other side of it having magazine and reload and such, it is actually even on sustained DPS a smaller increase than just taking that rate of fire and weapon damage. So mostly you would want to be in that rate of fire and weapon damage, which then would require every 12 seconds, if a fight is longer than 12 seconds, to weapon swap twice to get that bonus again. Because you kind of want to be in that weapon damage and rate of fire. That magazine size and such, even though, yeah, it adds to the magazine size, it adds quite a bit to sustain DPS of the build. It still loses out to just that extra damage that the rate of fire and the weapon damage side of things has. But even there, this being one of the bigger ones, and actually the biggest one in Centurion, because it's just a little bit ahead of the Bloody here with the Obliterate alongside of it, even then, it doesn't reach the 100% point against the active Overdogs. It is ahead by a decent margin against all of these. And that's kind of the thing. It is basically 10% behind against, for instance, Coyote and such, but then, for instance, about 20% ahead of it. Let's go actually look at this next one, which includes Tinkerer as well, because we, of course, excluded one big one in the Tinkerer, which generally with 2 damage talents can also be very competitive and be higher even than, for instance, the Centurion. For instance, if we do take Killer plus Streamline, there upstairs, though, we kept it without a weapon talent in there. The second we bring in the Tinkerer, we kind of have to include weapon talents into the mix, and that kind of makes things a little bit more messy. So up there, though, without the weapon talent, because most of the weapon talents would, for instance, Killer is a little bit smaller on the Coyote version than it is if we're using Overdogs, because the crit values are a little bit different. It isn't a humongous difference between them. Here, though, yeah, we are going to take the Overdogs here being all of them active, although we have this toggle, so we can inactivate the Overdogs. So we'll be using that later on to toggle it on and off to compare. Then we have here Overdogs, and then with the weapon talent, here we have a utility one, so just things like if we're taking Preservation or if we're taking Future Perfect, Fast Hands would affect the reload and would, for instance, affect the sustained DPS, but not the burst DPS. So we could kind of see this as the burst DPS calculation as well for Fast Hands. Then we have killer, streamline, measured, and we'll especially be using those also for the tinker, where we're combining killer plus streamline, killer plus measured, streamline plus measured, and then also each of those, killer, streamline, and measured, with a utility talent, so with a non-damage talent on the other end as well, as that is a popular way to go with it. For instance, for me, I've been really much enjoying putting killer plus fast stance on a lot of my striker play recently. Having fast stance back has put a smile on my face for quite a bit. If we look at it with the Overdogs active and then with, for instance, Killer, and we look at Killer plus Streamline, one of the bigger variants of Tinkerer, we see that if we compare it with OD Killer, and actually the abbreviation here that we'll be using is OD for the Overdogs for the purposes here. Not ongoing directive on this video, but then Overdogs. If we're taking that as the 100% point, which we're doing here again on this right side, because of course, yeah, that is a damage talent. But also here we can then see how much these damage talents actually add in. So for instance, for Killer, we see that it is just over 22%, a little bit bigger than, for instance, with the Coyote version. And that is the difference that it makes, because here our crit is a little bit lower because we don't have that Coyote in there to pump up our crit. So Killer actually becomes a little bit bigger for this build. Or for if you are running Overdogs. Streamline kind of in that 16 range, and then here measured around the 11% mark. It increases, but then if we compare that versus this Overdogs plus Killer that we have there, especially if we kind of start going down towards the Tinkerers, we see that all of those are actually pretty far behind it. A little bit more ahead than, for instance, the Coyote was. But still, mostly, even in going Streamline plus Killer, two of the bigger talents that we have available for Tinkerer, it is still 10% behind when the Overdogs is active. So it is now, with these two talents, it is effectively 20%. It is 20% behind when Overdogs isn't active, and then 10% ahead when it is active. And that 10%, of course, is a pretty big boon, especially if we can kind of lean into it and get it uptime going pretty decently. Now, here, of course, Streamline, not my pick. For instance, I like having my skills. Killer plus measured would be much more a thing that I tend to do if I'm going to damage talents. And we see that then it's basically 15% under, 15% over for the Overdogs whenever it is active. If we start looking at utility talents alongside of it, where we're just taking one damage talent on the Tinker, of course, it's going to fall behind a little bit more. But there is, of course, some comfort to be had from things like preservation or fast stance helping out. And that has a value of its own, basically. Here, though, yeah, we would still in damage now be dropping, even because that variant with the Tinker, of course, is even behind, for instance, the Coyote with just a singular talent, basically. If we're taking Tinker plus Killer, or if we're taking Coyote plus Killer, versus Tinker with Killer plus a utility, the Tinker plus Killer and utility will be behind that. Overall, though, what we see consistently through all of these calculations is that 30% is a lot. Against the Coyote, it's effectively a 10% under, 20% over. Against the Tinker in its best variation, it's a 20% under, 10% over. And overall, it's then going to come down to how much uptime we have. And here, let's take it into some gameplay and discuss the actual in-gameplay. Because more so than the damage numbers, we need to know the damage numbers, but more so we need to discuss it when it is active and it isn't. Here we're taking that striker that we were discussing with Obliterate here in the Overdogs. I do have a great 30 Lexington here with me as well, as I see that walking up on me. We don't have the active we don't have the modifiers on because, yeah, they are very powerful. Here, though, actually a good illustration, a 4-man patrol. All of these will be bonused. So a Grenadier, an Assault, a Rusher, all of those are actually enemies that will be bonused against. And with a lot of activities, that will be the case. Here we're coming up against the Nest. Here, because of retaliation, it is actually owned by the Hyenas here. Before we actually even really engage these enemies, let's discuss the tiering. So on the lowest tier, Assault, Grenadier, Medic is going to be higher. A Medic is on the... And we can always consult this. Not the smartest thing to do in combat, but yeah, tier 1 enemies, that medic, there's an engineer on the field, a tier 2. So we'll be bonused, especially against that assault and those grenadiers. So we should, if we can, prioritize them. But also, as we saw in the numbers, if I'm shooting here, basically 3 out of 5 enemies are bonused. We have the active, will be active against them. They are the lowest of the tiers. The medic, for instance, is a higher tier. I'll kill them 10% slower. There, though, I want them out of the way. So they were the obvious target to go for. And then we'll just take that hit. Overall, because it is a 30% increase, I feel it is well worth doing things like that. Because we can, even if most of the enemies, well, it depends. If against important enemies, as we discussed, for instance, lovebirds fight or something, there I wouldn't take it. But here, that grenadier will be bonused against, that assault we're bonused against. Here, actually, we'll need to destroy this turret before we'll be bonused against that engineer. But we wouldn't be already, because likely there is some other enemies on the field. Drone controller, or actually controller, tier 1 enemy, highest tier. Assault, lowest tier. Now, you don't need to, in gameplay, think like this, but especially knowing grenadiers, assaults, and rushers are bonus, it makes it easy to go for them. But when this medic is going for a revive, I'm going to kill them, go for them. If I'm killing them 10% slower, but I'm killing most other things 30% faster, or about 20% faster versus a coyote, that then still works out. Here, the named is an engineer. Now, we don't here, of course, on control points, the final that spawns, we don't have that much control over. So we'll be 10% slower against them, most likely, unless we really work our way through everything else. So yeah, we have a grenadier over there as well, tier 3 enemy. That controller would be a tier 1 enemy, so it would be above the engineer, actually. So we can actually kill them after. But I'm especially trying to get a lineup against that. We're just going to take them away. Even if we aren't bonus against them, we still are on a full red build and have our damage. And now, well, the turret is there, skill proxy, so that's a tier 1. Now, they're the last enemy. I'm not in combat with anything else, they're bonused. So we can work it in that way, and yeah, as we kind of discussed as well, it is a way to think about this, especially considering, yes, some of the legendaries. We said DUA already, but consider as well that Manning has somewhat similar. We could kill everything else and leave those 2 tanks at the end to kill with the bonus up. A bunch of other places as well that we can consider it in that way. Some of the raid fights, if we're going up against Buddy and Lucy, there's only 2 Warhounds in the field. But then it also depends if those are actually correctly attributed. I haven't per se tested the raids or such. Let's call in the defense wave here. We'll just sit up here and shoot down. We'll be a little bit outside of optimal. But here we'll start having rushers alongside of it with hyenas on the assault. There won't be any rushers from the control points. But here actually, all 4 enemies that spawned were bonused against. And this is kind of the thing. So for instance, for some of the factions, it is perfectly, if we're doing control points and we're doing them with a crit chance, crit damage build, because we could of course headhunter our way through these and such. But if we're just doing it in this way, again, another wave, and that's also why I'm running the pulse here. 2 rushers on an assault, we're bonus against everybody. But it really does depend on what you're doing, because for instance, for some of the other factions, I find, for instance, having mini tanks would generally be a thing that either I leave if they're in a position that I can just avoid them, or I need that right now. And they have a big pool of health, of course. Same for Warhounds, which are, both of those are in some of the higher tiers. So we have mini tanks down here on tier 2, and then we would still need to kill everything else before this becomes bonus, and same for Warhounds there. Or yeah, if we're just getting ourselves into a fight in the street and a Marauder comes overhead, which is also tier 1, yeah, that's a bit of an issue. Here though, yeah, we have mostly enemies that we're bonused against. And now we've killed everything else again, and the medic is up. Now the medic is getting a grenadier up. If we're smart about it, we'll kill the grenadier first. And now that medic is firstly the only enemy alive, but also, yeah, there would be, you know, there is nothing below them. And this then, yeah, illustrates kind of, there is a lot of uptime, especially because that tier 3 has assaults, has grenadiers, has rushers, has snipers. And because of that, there is actually a lot of uptime there. To a degree that for general play, if we're just running around in the open world, the Overdogs more than works out. I wouldn't consider it, for instance, yet. The faction matters as well for it. If we have mini tanks and such, if we have warhounds, that changes the equation a little bit. But still not by that much, I feel. Let's actually take it up against some Black Disc. And for that, let's go here to air and space. We'll take the same build as was. And again, the smart way to set this up, and I'm not doing that here, I have 57, 129, especially for killer, it would be beneficial to actually up that to the 60, and we would do that by, yeah, swapping these 3 crit chance mods to crit damage, and of course the crit chance mods on weapons are 5, and then on gear it's 6, and then it's obvious then, yeah, if we take the crit chance on the gear instead, where I could take it, for instance, on some of these pieces and swap out some mods and such, we could take, instead of the 15 crit chance that we have here, we could take 18 crit chance on the gear. We would lose, of course, 6 crit damage. It doesn't, because also the crit damage mods are smaller. But then, yeah, we would land on 60, 123 as we did in the calculations. I'm too lazy to do that here. And that's also a fine way to think about it, because here as well, if I want to swap back to a Coyote, if there's no Coyotes in the team and I'm running it in the team, that Coyote is still going to be worthwhile, because also if others are running Overdogs, I'm still bonusing them as well. But then, yeah, I can just swap out, in this case, I think just one of these 2 crit chances here and go back to a Coyote at 51 crit chance. So for laziness sake, we can do it that way. But the optimal way would be 60, especially since I'm running, because I am running killer as well. Here again, let's pulse and let's take stock of our situation. But also, you don't per se need to think like this, because, for instance, here the only enemy, yeah, we have assaults, we have rushers, and such, and there is one drone controller, which would be tier 2. But we don't need to think it that way. Hell, even I'm gonna kill them first, and it's a red. It's gonna die plenty fast, even without per se thinking about the order of things and playing into it. We still have continuously good bonuses. One of the reasons I've come here to Air and Space is in the second room here, we'll have Warhounds guaranteed. There's always a Sniper Warhound here, in group settings 2 even. Do we go for the Warhound first? Now, this then would be the thing of like, okay, changing playstyle a little bit. I would very much go for those Warhounds first, kill one, that will jam the other one, jam the mini tank as well. We have a controller, we have 2 assaults. Now, what I might do here, though, is actually go for those 2 assaults quickly, because, yeah, we can take them out. And then, yeah, I'm still going to focus down one of these Warhounds, even though I kind of made them sit down in a bad spot. We'll go for the other one. Even when we're, of course, killing like these enemies, even though they're bigger enemies overall, if we're killing them 10% slower than a Coyote, but then everything else 20% faster than a Coyote, that's still on completion time, on the overall time it takes to get through an area, it's going to be faster. And even if we don't consider it in that way, so here as well, I am actually now bonused against the mini tank, so I'm going to actually take that. We're not going to be bonused, or actually we would be. Both of these are in the same tier, but you don't need to go all the way into thinking like that. And again as well, last enemy alive, we're always going to be bonused against. We'll skip that crate in the back there. For loot, let's just keep going quickly. Let's take it into this somewhat bigger and more chaotic fight up here. And then, yeah, even just playing it normally, because here again, Assault, Grenadier will be bonus against, Medic we won't be yet, and Controller and a Mini Tank, neither of those either. So what I am going to do here, though, is just, yeah, go for the Grenadier and Assault first, if I can. And we can. But actually, when this medic stands up and makes himself a target like that, I'm not going to pass that up. neither that mini tank, even though there's an assault in the field. Because, yeah, we do so much damage anyway here as well. I'm kind of on a maxed out build, maxed out watch, maxed out grading with a top tier talent and killer that I'm trying to keep decent uptime on. Yeah, we have enough damage. But yeah, there are so many of those enemies, and that's the thing here with the Overdogs as well. The most common enemies, Grenadiers, Assaults, Rushers, they're all bonused. And the last enemy alive is also bonused against. That's the reason I feel it works out really well in general play, and is well worth using there. So technically here, if I'm smart about it, I'll kill that Assault first, get the bonus going up against the Warhound as well. There would be the higher tier, but also they're the only thing alive as well, so we'll be bonus against them. Clearing the field works out really well. In the open world, though, we sometimes have the thing of getting aggroed by things that we're not intending to fight. Here in missions, of course, we don't have that. We don't have suddenly a convoy coming up in here through this mission and getting in our way. Now here again as well, that's a support, so that would be a higher tier. This tank would also be a higher tier, but we've killed everything else, and we'll now go for now. Now the thing we could do with that heavy as well is, if they are kind of in our way, is to, and there for instance, on this wave, I did it in the exact wrong order of operations. We killed two enemies we weren't bonus against, and then killed Assault, which would have, if we killed them first, we'd get the other ones, but it's not per se worth going that much into it unless it's you know, unless it's available easily. Rushers, Grenadiers, Assault, everybody was bonus. We could chain them and then, yeah, come back to them later with, for instance, the Black Dust one. Again, a Rusher, a Grenadier, and a Assault, so we're bonused against everybody. But this just to kind of illustrate that, yeah, for instance, when we have Warhounds joining the fray, it does change our thinking a little bit, because, for instance, with those Warhounds, we do want to deal with them. They are very dangerous enemies. And of course, for instance, with those sniper ones, when they explode, they'll do a disrupt against everything else, and that would, for instance, give us some time with the other Warhound. But if we do it in that order, then yeah, we would not be bonused against them. But the thing is that, yeah, the 20% over and the 10% under against a Coyote, or even the 15-15 that we have, for instance, if I was running Tinker with Killer and Measured. Although then we couldn't run the Lexington, so we'd lose a little bit of damage there, but, you know, it's fine. The issue is just, yeah, what is the uptime? And overall, I feel, especially on the Overdogs, the uptime is very much there, because if we think of it as, yeah, Grenadiers, Assaults, Rushers, Snipers being all in this tier 3, that's a lot of the enemies. And also the simple enemies that we generally would want to take out anyway. It does mean that, for instance, yeah, there I shot a medic without them being bonused or being bonused against them. But we're on a build that is so strong that, yeah, overall, it still works out. It is basically over the encounter of this and then the completion time of a mission, for instance. Even if I'm sometimes killing a little bit slower, overall, I'm killing faster. And there's a little bit of influence I can have on that as well. And I kind of also just enjoy that gameplay, thinking of like, okay, that enemy's bonus, that enemy's bonus, that enemy's bonus. And then if I kill all those three, then this one. And that would overall improve my outcome a little bit, but just shooting enemies and overall just taking it that, yeah, a lot of the enemies that spawn will be bonused like this if we're just in general play. In specific play, though, that kind of then falls apart. If we were to take this, for instance, into, let's say, incursion and such, yeah, there are some fights there where we are guaranteed to have other enemies around the bosses and such, which would, for instance, yeah, remove our ability to do this extra damage against the boss. But then as well, if we're just fighting right, for instance, on the third boss there, he's the only enemy there for most of those fights, except for the final phase where there's a tank with him, but he's also classified a tank, so we'll still have the bonus. So against right, for instance, it's the right choice, but then against the Lovebirds, it's the wrong choice. Do we want to run this and then swap it in and swap it out and such? That's becomes then the question. If we're min-maxing, yeah, we would. But generally, that's also one of the issues, is that consistency has a value all to its own. Let's actually go start looking at a different way we can run this as well, and that is for the Pestilence. As lastly here, let's discuss the implications of this item applying to both skills and also here, for instance, to the Pesti ticks. Now, of course, it should apply to the Pesti hits, just the weapon damage hitting the enemy. But this 30% is also applying to the Pestilence ticks, its damage over time component. Now, I don't feel that it should. All other amplified weapon damages that we have don't apply in this way, including Ongoing Directive, which shares a name with the, at least abbreviation with the OD, being both for Overdogs and Ongoing Directive. In the past, Ongoing Directive did used to apply to the Pestilence sticks and also used to apply to things like the ballistic skills, so turret, drone, sniper turret, all were affected by OD, and as long as you had OD rounds in your weapon, they would be bonused in that way. In this case, that is here the case for this as well. With Ongoing Directive, it was eventually removed. It no longer applies in that way. That's also why we don't use it in that way. Here, though, this amplifies weapon damage is applying to skills and is applying to things like the Pestilence sticks. Now, with the case of the Pestilence sticks, it is actually dependent on the tiering still. It isn't just, just always on 30%, but it is 30% against if it's on the lowest tier enemy. Now, we don't have that much control over where the Pestilence stick goes. We can apply it first, of course, but once it starts jumping around, we don't have that much control over which enemy type it goes onto. But overall, the increase that this provides with that 30% is well worth it, and this has become now the build picture as well in the build collection for this build. And one of the reasons is that last enemy effect as well, because usually it'll be an enemy that's kind of sitting all the way in the back that you couldn't hit the whole fight anyway. There was just one sniper all the way in the back hiding most of the time. And when the Pestilence stick gets to them, and usually by the end, towards the end of a longer fight, so if we're doing a control point or if we're doing things like some of the mission parts, then we would have a full tick going onto that enemy. Even though they wouldn't still stand up, maybe they will just get decimated by that Pestilence stick. And the increase that we have here is well worth it because, yeah, on the loss end of it, we don't lose that much, especially on the setup. Also, yeah, if we take it to its build picture, as the build picture for this 1.03, which used to be the Lengmo variant, it still is a Lengmo variant, but was used to also use the Lengmo chest. Here with the Overdogs, one of the things we gain as well is that we don't need the Lengmo chest per se anymore. If you have it, you still can use it, and you can put the Petrov piece that I have here somewhere else. If we zoom in a little bit, yeah, now we have, because of the Overdogs being here, we can have a Petrov chest instead. Have the backbone would still be a harder piece to get, but then the holster and then the mask are Lengmo pieces, Fox's Prayer, and then Overdogs, making for a much easier build to put together for the kind of the optimal variant here. In the past, of course, with the Lengmo version, we also had a way of going with the Sacrifice, which would be also the other choice here. We'll see in the numbers in a second why I've gone with the Petrov. The difference between these is tiny in damage end, but then on the incoming damage end, of course, 10% more incoming with the Sacrifice. But the Sacrifice is definitely also an easy piece to get. Most of us will have a Sacrifice lying around. We might not all have a Petrov chest lying around. I did already from my tipping skills testing. So yeah, that's the piece we put in here. But overall, of course, this is a much, much easier piece to get than that Lengmo chest, which we needed to recore, which was a true super unicorn because also it's a blue core and we wanted to have chance crit damage on it. So overall, this has become the new build picture for this. But the question then is this going to stick around like this? Because in the same way that once OD got fixed, that it no longer applied to the ballistic skills, it no longer also applied to the Pestilence sticks. Here, the same might happen for the Overdogs as, yeah, overall, it shouldn't apply to skills. And I feel whenever that gets fixed, this might go back to the other variant. But for the time being, this is a much more, this is the way I would run a Pesti build. Let's go look at its numbers. And for that, we'll come to this third multi-calculator in that spreadsheet. And in here, we're comparing the Coyote older variant of this build up against the Overdogs here with Perfect Glass Cannon and then Overdogs with the Petrov chest. And this is then also what I based my choice of a Petrov chest on. It is laid out a little bit differently than normal with these multi-calculators, where we have it in segments of 3, because we have the build itself first, and then the burst and sustain DPS and the damage per mag for it. Then we have the tick, the damage over time component, and then here we are basically at 50 stacks. So if we had a full stack going, how much would that be on an enemy? And especially that is this number. The average damage does include actually the armor rate that we have here, the armor percentage rate, which we're putting at 60% overall. But the full tick would be that number over there. And then we're combining the burst DPS of 1 tick, basically, and 1 full tick, and then the build's burst DPS. This way we can kind of compare them against each other here as well. The percentages are actually, the ticks are comparing to the ticks, and the combines are comparing against the combines, just to make it a little bit easier to see. But basically we have one of the builds in a segment of 3, and especially we're kind of looking at the DPS of the build and then also the DPS of the tick. Because overall, with Pestilence builds, some people really lean into the tick. So for instance, going, well, in the past, Sawyers, which could up that quite a bit. But those are also very tedious items to use because you have to stand still quite a bit. Overall, I find that the balance, going for a balance between the build's DPS and having a pretty good tick, is better than trying to just go all in on the tick and really forgetting about the build's DPS. Because first of all, let's look at that the build is doing around 10 million, the tick is doing 1.5 in the older version. Here, even in the newer version, the build is doing, with the Overdogs active, around close to 12 million-ish, but the tick is close to 2 million-ish. It's 1/6 for the tick. You should not forget about the build. Now, of course, on the build will do a lot, even if you give up a little bit of its stats. But yeah, maximizing the build and maximizing the tick together is the way I generally go with it. Then what we see as well is the old version at max, and with a grade 30 weapon with unstoppable force all the way going, 50 stacks on enemy. We were doing 1.5 in the high 1.5s on the Pesti tick. Here on the Pesti tick, when Overdogs is active, we're doing in the high 1.9s, which is quite a lot, of course. Here as well, we do have the toggle to toggle off Overdogs. Even with Overdogs off, it is still a 1.2 into the 1.229 million. Still lower 1.2s. So yeah, it really depends on that Overdogs being active, but especially here, of course, when we're below, when Overdogs is inactive, when we compare it on percentages just between the tick of the old version and this version, it is a less than 5% difference below. So it's less than 5% under, we could even say 4% under. And then when Overdogs is active on that tick, it's close to a 25% over. So the over-under on the Overdogs versus the old version is quite a lot. And that is, of course, yeah, the tick especially. On the build DPS itself, we can see, yeah, it's 17% ahead. And yeah, from that, we can surmise that it's likely going to be around 10% below. And yeah, it is 10% below. Kind of the same as we saw with the Coyote in just the Striker builds earlier. So we're 10% below if we're shooting the wrong target, and we're quite a bit above when we're here. But as we discussed, yeah, we see a lot of those enemies. We see a lot of the the enemies that are bonused, especially assaults, grenadiers, rushers, snipers. All of those are bonused always because they're the lowest tier. Being tier 3 enemies, yeah, this for me is kind of a no-brainer outside of certain situations. There might be situationally a place where I go, okay, there's going to be way too many mini tanks, let's say, or way too many of higher enemy types. And I wouldn't per se then maybe pick this. But even then, I would just run this, and then, yeah, sometimes I'll be 10% below, but then sometimes I'm also 20% above. And overall, in general play, I feel, yeah, the 20% above happens quite a lot. Then we have the question between going Petrov or going Perfect Glass Cannon. So with the Perfect Glass Cannon, we're also taking 10% more damage incoming. It is 60% incoming damage increase instead of 50%. And damage-wise, between the two and on the tick as well, it isn't that big of a difference. It is less than a sixth of a percent, or a little bit more than a sixth of a percent difference of them between them. And for that, I'm perfectly fine going with the Petrov chest, having 10% less incoming damage. It is somewhat noticeable. It won't make a difference against snipers and such. They'll still take you to health gate if you're getting tapped by a sniper warhound, let's say. But against chip damage, SMG rushers and such, it is noticeable that you can stand up in front of them a little bit longer and maybe get the kill in before you hit your health gate. And damage-wise, the difference isn't enough here that I would lean towards, per se, going with the sacrifice. But if you have a sacrifice lying around and you don't have a Petrov chest, yeah, it is technically even more damage, but also the incoming should be considered. Also, as in that equation, and to have that there as well, I added it at the bottom here. Here, of course, on the build's DPS end, the tick doesn't change, but if we are in the wrong range for the Coyote, which of course doesn't affect the tick at all, but of course this is if we're in the 15 to 25 meter range. If we are in the 0 to 15, so if, for instance, an enemy gets too close to us or we get too close to an enemy, we lose a further 6%, and that should be actually considered as well. Because here, when we now turn off Overdogs and compare that, it is now a 6% difference. Because Coyote should also be considered that, yeah, sometimes you're not in the right range for it. And usually as well, if you're too in the long range, it is around the same percentage for this build. So if we're too far away or too close, then now as well, on the build DPS, yeah, it's just 6 or well, a little bit over 5% ahead, because this is on 90% and then this is on 96%. But then, yeah, when we're doing it right, and overall, yeah, there are so many enemies where we can be doing it right, especially as well. Again, the last enemy always going to be bonused, and the upper bound, so the over-under on it is just too massive to ignore, because, yeah, we shoot up a lot. Let's see this in action for a second, and then we'll round it out. And here, let's take that exact build up against some of the enemies here. We're taking the Petrov chest. Again, the difference between taking this and taking the sacrifice is in damage end. The sacrifice does do a little bit more damage, but yeah, that incoming does hurt a little. That's why I'm leaning towards the Petrov, but of course the Petrov chest would be dedicated to just this build, basically. A sacrifice you might already be using for other builds and would save on an item piece. One thing I looked at as well is actually if we swap out the contractors, or the contract spreads, but if we swap out the Fox's Sprayer for the Petrov piece here, it is actually a choice you could make. It is about 10% lower when the enemies are in or out of cover, so that the detox applies from the Fox's Sprayer. And it is 5% behind, or 5% ahead when enemies are in cover and they are getting, they wouldn't get the detox, but the Petrov weapon damage would apply. Overall, though, I still think going with the Fox's Sprayer is my preferred way, but the Petrov moving, well, we would then have the Petrov here on the knee pads and then have a sacrifice chest as an option as well. Here we are taking the full 30 grading as well and such. Again, the modifiers are off just to keep it a little bit more tame, because as well with the seasonal modifiers, things like Zealot, things like Sanitation can add a ton of damage. Here, let's pulse actually. So we have 2 LMGs, we have a support, and yeah, actually off the top of my head, I don't even remember where support is. We could always, of course, go in here, and yeah, supports are tier 2. Heavy weapons, the LMG guys, are tier 1. So the optimal way to assault this would be first the assault, then the support, and then the LMGs. So let's do that actually here as well. I'll go for this guy, focus them down. And we are, of course, in the bound to cheese area, not per se doing it the bound to cheese way. And the tick increase is very noticeable. Even with a few stacks on an enemy, it is much more noticeable that we're doing so much more as long as it is active. And here especially, the thing is, yeah, the last enemy alive will be bonused anyway. Yeah, they're instantly going into retaliation. They didn't like me shooting up even a few of their friends. But of course, as we build up stacks, even though they're going now on the other side, one is on the other side, which will likely force it all on the other side. Again, rushers we're bonus against, assaults we're always bonused against, assault again bonused against, Scorcher, which is actually, yeah, common weapon enemy type here with Outcast, but also, yeah, any other enemy again. That LMG up there, though, we're not bonus against, but actually we're letting all of the other Pesti ticks go onto them. Once I kill this assault and that grenadier, actually we are bonused against this this guy as well. So we can be smart about it and get a little bit more out of it. But also, actually, what we can do is just let loose. Even though we're killing that guy maybe 5% slower, as we saw from the DPS calculations, as I see Oxy, and I'm getting the hell out of there.
Target down. Good job.
That's a dangerous skill. But we can see that, yeah, we are doing a lot more damage. Here, that being an assault, we're getting close to the full increase there. We'll have to kill the skill proxy. So yeah, they got a skill proxy out. He's setting me on fire, not letting me ADS. Can I actually help them a few more times and then go back to this? Because yeah, the skill proxy would count as a tier 1 enemy, and yeah, we wouldn't have bonus. But now, with everything else dead, we're bonused against this guy, so... Generally that would happen anyway, is that some of the more dangerous enemies stay up as being the last one alive, and yeah, then we'll be bonused against them anyway.
Good job, Agent.
Overall, that's one of the reasons I think the Overdogs will work out for a lot of situations, is that, yeah, that any other enemy, there's a lot of them in there, and a lot of important ones. The counterpoint then being, yeah, sometimes we do want to kill that LMG guy first, and we can still, but we would be at a detriment versus some of the other items. But this being a 30%, yeah, kind of makes it, for me, especially here, for instance, with the Pestilence, a no-brainer, because it is also one of the few exotics that will actually affect that Pesti tick. Let's take it to a conclusion. And to conclude this video, first off, let's pet the damn dog. As yeah, the Overdogs that we're getting here, they make for good scritches on Bronson here. But also, they make for a really good piece to use. I feel the Overdogs is definitely one of the top picks for general play. It will work out more than well enough in a lot of general play to be worth using. And because of that, it will show up on a lot of builds going forward as a piece that we can take. Now, there are places it won't work well, and you just have to be aware of those. In general play, though, this is a loyal hound to keep at your side. I've enjoyed running it a lot. The Pesti build, it applying to Pesti, at least we'll see if in the long term it goes that way. And in the future as well, if you're watching this in the long future, maybe see if the build picture on the Pestilence has been put back to being a coyote again. That would give away that, yeah, it no longer applies, as I'll keep those build pictures up to date, of course. But for the time being, it does apply to that, and it even applies to some skills, which I definitely feel it shouldn't. And because of that, actually on some skill builds even, it is the top pick. But for general play, just in red builds, it is definitely one to pick. Even just playing it without considering really the tiering will work out more than well enough. But if we actually lean into it, understand that tiering a little bit, and especially just, yeah, again, Grenadiers, Assaults, Rushers, and Snipers, you're basically always bonused against, and those are very much the most common enemies you'll meet. Because of that, the uptime on it is actually pretty good. I would just recommend as well, in just if you're doing something consistently and a lot, so for instance, I have done that for myself, doing, for instance, going around doing public executions and such, or other activities, propagandas and such, against, let's say, Outcast, for instance, it actually has basically perfect uptime. There are so few other enemy types of tier 2 or tier 3 variety in there, especially, for instance, public executions against Outcast. Unless there's a tank there, it's bonus against everybody right away, because there are Scorchers, Assaults, Grenadiers. That's basically what there is, except if there's a tank there as well. But then we'll just kill the tank last, and we'll also have the full Pesti tick going up against them quite often. So it does behoove you to maybe, yeah, analyze some gameplay if you really want to min-max it. But overall, also, I don't think you need to. We can kind of take this as crit chance, but then just enemy chance. The chance of running into the right enemy is pretty high, and because of that, it does work out. So yeah, thank you for watching through this Overdogs video. I hope it was informative and enjoyable. If it was, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. It does help out and helps us teach some tricks to Bronson so he can roll around as he does there. And for the next video, we'll actually be going to go into the journey caches, and I'm going to open up those and give my first reactions, and then also kind of show the builds you can make with them. And that was a very enjoyable video to make last season, and a lot of people did enjoy it as well. So we'll make one for this season. And then likely we'll actually do the same in-depth look treatment into the Tempest, which has been now available from Summit Floor 100. And yeah, we've been farming that one up a little bit. I already have my DTOC one for myself, but we've been trying to help other people's as well get them on stream. So yeah, I hope to catch you in those. And as always, have a good night.